I heard my husband tell his mother on the phone that I'd been having episodes again. I have never had an episode. Not once, not ever, in 6 years of marriage. I was standing in the hallway outside our bedroom laundry basket on my hip, close enough to hear every word, and Corbin didn't even lower his voice. 2 days later, I found a business card for a family law attorney tucked inside his laptop bag, a note scrawled on the back in his own handwriting. Documented pattern custody. I'm Imani. I'm 33. And this is the story of how my mother-in-law spent years quietly convincing my own husband I was unstable using a version of documentation she had absolutely no right to be building in the first place. We had a full, busy life together, 2 kids, a dog that shed everywhere, a minivan I swore I'd never own, and now can't imagine living without. Corbin and I split the school runs, argued about the thermostat, fell asleep most nights, mid-conversation about something completely unremarkable. I would have told you without hesitation that we knew each other completely the way you only know someone after 8 years of ordinary Tuesdays stacked on top of each other. I work as a compliance auditor for a regional network of outpatient therapy and psychiatric clinics. My job is to review patient files, billing records, and session documentation for irregularities, places where a note doesn't match a claim, where a diagnosis code doesn't line up with what's actually in the chart, where somebody's added information to a file that shouldn't be there. I've caught clinics quietly padding records for insurance purposes more times than I can count, and I've testified about it more than once when a case escalated that far. I never once thought I'd end up running that exact same read on my own file at the very clinic network I audit for a living, the kind of coincidence that feels less like luck and more like the universe finally giving me the one tool I actually needed. Corbin and I met at a friend's housewarming 8 years ago, married 2 years after that. He's kind, mostly steady, the kind of man who remembers small things. My coffee order, which of my coworkers I actually like the anniversary of my grandmother's death every single year, without being reminded always with a small, quiet gesture instead of a big one. His mother Harriet was around a lot from the very beginning, in the specific way some mothers are around a lot, always just happening to be in the neighborhood, always the first call when anything went wrong, always positioning herself as the one who understood her son best, long before I understood what that positioning would eventually cost me. I didn't clock the first strange thing as strange at all, not for a long time. Early in our marriage, in the middle of an ordinary disagreement about something forgettable, whose turn it was to host Thanksgiving, I think Corbin said almost offhand, "The doctor did say stress makes this harder for you." I remember pausing, genuinely confused because I hadn't discussed anything like that with any doctor ever. I let it go. I told myself he'd probably mixed me up with something he'd read or misremembered a comment from our one round of couples counseling early in the marriage back when we were working through some ordinary newlywed friction. It felt too small and too strange to be worth an argument. That's the thing nobody tells you about this particular kind of betrayal. It doesn't arrive all at once the way an affair does in one gut punch moment you can point to. It arrives in inches, deniable every single time, small enough on its own that questioning it makes you sound like the unreasonable one, which looking back might have been exactly the point. I mentioned the doctor comment to my sister once, months later, half joking, expecting her to laugh it off with me. She didn't laugh. She just said, "Wait, what, doctor?" And I remember fumbling for an answer that didn't actually exist, realizing in real time that I'd never once pushed Corbin to clarify it himself. I'd absorbed it instead, filed it away as one of those small marital mysteries not worth a fight the way you let 100 other tiny things go every year without a second thought. The complicating moment came at a family Thanksgiving 3 years ago. Harriet pulled me aside in the kitchen, voice soft and warm, and asked, "How are you doing today, really? Corbin says it's been a hard week for you." Nothing had been hard that week. Nothing at all. But she asked with such genuine-sounding concern, hand resting gently on my arm, that I actually thanked her for checking in. I told her I was fine, a little tired, nothing serious. I had no idea yet that this exact kind of loaded, caring-sounding question was going to become a pattern I'd spend years not noticing, or that she'd go on to report my hard week to Corbin as confirmation of whatever story she was already building. The escalation wasn't one crack. It was years of them so evenly spaced I never once stepped back far enough to see the whole shape. A birthday dinner where I raised my voice once mildly about a reservation getting bungled, and Corbin's hand found my knee under the table in a way that felt less like affection and more like a request to settle down. A phone call I overheard months before the hallway one where he told a coworker he had to check in on some things at home in a tone that made it sound like a fragile situation rather than an ordinary Tuesday. None of these on their own would have meant anything. Stacked together over years, they built a shape I only recognized once I finally stepped far enough back to see all of it at once. I need you to understand something before I keep going, because it matters for everything after this. I didn't start questioning any of it because I stopped loving Corbin or because I went looking for a reason to distrust my own marriage. I started because a woman who spends her career catching small inconsistencies in other people's clinical records eventually notices when the exact same kind of inconsistency starts showing up in the story of her own life. It's a strange thing realizing the skill that pays your mortgage is also the thing that finally makes you trust your own memory again. Over those years, Corbin started treating ordinary disagreements differently than he used to. Softer, more careful, almost clinical, like he was managing something fragile instead of just talking to his wife. If I got frustrated about something completely reasonable, a canceled flight, a bad day at work, he'd get this specific look, part concern and part caution, and say something like, "Let's not spiral, okay?" I'd never spiraled about anything in my life before those years. I started slowly to wonder if maybe I just hadn't noticed myself doing it. I need you to know something before I go further, because it recontextualizes everything I've told you up to here. For months, I actually started to believe they might be right. That's how good it was. Not dramatic, not cruel on the surface, just patient, consistent, and always delivered with enough warmth that questioning it felt like the unreasonable reaction every single time. I bought a journal that year on my own, without telling anyone specifically to track my own moods, an act I understand now as a kind of quiet self-surveillance I'd been talked into without a single explicit word ever being said to me directly. I filled almost half of it before I found the folder that explained why I'd felt the need to start it in the first place. The professional part of my brain finally caught up about 4 months ago after the phone call in the hallway. I couldn't stop thinking about the phrase documented pattern. Documentation is my entire job. I know exactly what it takes to build something that holds up, and I know exactly how easy it is to fake if the person building it has enough access and enough patience. I pulled our couples counseling file from years earlier, using my professional access at the exact clinic where we'd gone completely within my job's scope since compliance reviews are randomly assigned across the whole network. And this file happened to be sitting in a batch I was already auditing that month, which felt like either an enormous coincidence or the only lucky break I'd gotten in this entire situation. What I found stopped me cold. Attached to our joint file was a secondary folder labeled Collateral Contact H. Rhea's full of typed emails going back nearly 6 years, all from Harriet, all addressed to our former therapist, each one framed as a concerned family member offering context. Some of it was small deniable she seemed overwhelmed at dinner last week. Some of it was much more specific, describing behavior I never once exhibited, dressed up carefully enough to sound like genuine clinical observation instead of what it actually was. I sat with that folder open on my laptop for a long time before I let myself really absorb it. Our therapist, a woman named Anya, had apparently taken every one of those emails as good faith collateral information, which in a lot of legitimate cases is exactly how family input is supposed to work. She'd folded pieces of Harriet's language into her own clinical notes over the years, careful professional phrasing never once flagged, as coming from a source who'd never actually witnessed most of what she was describing. I read every entry twice sitting cross-legged on our bedroom floor, with the laptop balanced on my knees, the house quiet around me, Corbin already asleep down the hall. Some of the language was clinical enough that I almost admired the craft of it in a horrible way. Harriet had clearly learned over years exactly which phrases would read as concerned family member observation instead of what they actually were. I didn't confront anyone that week. I did what I do for a living instead. I pulled every session note from that file, cross-referenced each one against actual appointment dates, and built a timeline showing exactly which concerns appeared in the record within days of specific emails from Harriet, never once corroborated by an actual session with me, never once verified against anything I'd said in the room. For the next several days, I lived a strange doubled kind of life. I went to work, audited other clinics' records for the same kind of quiet documentation drift I was finding in my own, and came home and made dinner and asked Corbin about his day, saying nothing about the folder sitting open on my laptop in the other room. I told my coworker Femi about it eventually in the vaguest terms I could manage. He didn't buy the vague framing for a second. "You flagged this exact pattern in 3 different clinics this year alone," he said. "You know what it looks like when you see it. Trust the read. It was good advice. I needed somebody outside my own house to say it back to me plainly." I drove out to the clinic's archive office myself the following week, sat in my car in the lot for almost 10 minutes before I went in, not because I was scared exactly, but because I wanted to be completely sure of every date before I let this become real. The lot was mostly empty that early, just a couple of cars glinting under fluorescent security lights. Ordinary people inside filing ordinary paperwork, none of them carrying anything close to what I was about to walk out with. I've built enough compliance case files to know you don't walk into a conversation like the one I was about to have with a hunch. You walk in with something that can survive somebody trying to argue with it. Inside, I pulled the certified session note printouts page by page, laying each one against a printed copy of the corresponding email from Harriet's folder, spreading everything across a table in the archive room until it looked less like a family and more like the kind of fraud case I build for the network every single month. The pattern held every single time for 6 straight years. An email would arrive. Within days, language echoing it softened, clinicalized, but unmistakably the same shape would appear in a session note attributed to ongoing concerns even in sessions Harriet herself had never attended. I photographed every matched pair before I left the same way I'd document evidence for any real compliance case, because some part of me already understood that Corbin was going to need to see it laid out this plainly to actually believe it. That evening, I set the folder down on our kitchen table without a word, pressed play on a voice memo I'd recorded of myself reading 3 of the emails out loud, back to back, and let it run. Corbin's face didn't change at first confusion, mostly like he genuinely couldn't place what he was hearing. Then somewhere around the second email, something shifted, and I watched him actually start doing the math himself in real time, the same math I'd spent weeks doing alone. "I need you to hear this from me," I said once the recording finished instead of from a lawyer's business card in your bag. "None of this happened. Not the episodes, not the spiraling, none of it. Your mother built this one email at a time for 6 years. Harriet was there that evening too, dropping off something for the kids' timing that in hindsight felt less like coincidence and more like habit. She heard the last of it from the doorway and didn't try to deny any of it right away. That came a beat later once the shock wore off enough for her to find her voice, which rose fast and sharp higher than I'd ever heard it. "I was protecting this family," she said, voice cracking on the word protecting, rising almost to a shout, before she caught it and pulled it back down. "You have no idea what it's like to watch your only son build a whole life around someone and just step back and hope it's enough. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to stay necessary to him." "Necessary," I repeated. "You made yourself necessary by making him believe I needed managing." "That's not protection, Harriet. That's just a different way of taking something that was never yours to take." For 1 second, just one, I saw exactly why she'd done it. A woman terrified of becoming irrelevant to the son she'd spent her whole life organized around, who'd found a slow, deniable way to stay indispensable by quietly appointing herself the only person who truly understood what was really going on with me. And then that second passed, and I was just standing in my own kitchen looking at 6 years of my own reactions I'd spent quietly editing down, all because of a story that was never true in the first place. I want to tell you it ended there clean and complete at that table. it didn't. What ended there was the version of Harriet I was willing to excuse without a real accounting. What came after took much longer, and some of it is still unfolding slower and messier than I would have liked if I'm honest about it. It wasn't until almost 3 weeks later that I found out what happened on the clinic side of all of this. Anya, our former therapist, self-reported the entire situation to her licensing board the moment I brought her the timeline before I'd even asked her to. She told me in a short, careful phone call that she genuinely believed she was incorporating legitimate family context, the way she'd been trained to, and that realizing how thoroughly it had been weaponized was its own kind of gutting. "I keep going back through the notes," she said, "trying to find the moment I should have called you directly instead of just folding in what your mother-in-law sent. I don't think there was one clean moment. I think it was 100 small ones, and I missed every single one of them. She's since had to amend 6 years of clinical notes across our file, a process that's still ongoing, and she's changed her own intake procedure for collateral contacts because of what happened to us. Specifically, new patients now have to explicitly consent in writing before any family member's outside input gets folded into a session note at all. Harriet, for her part, hasn't fully accounted for any of it, not really. She's apologized in the vague, deflecting way that isn't quite an apology, more of a, 'I'm sorry it hurt you' than an, 'I'm sorry I did it.' Corbin has limited her access to us significantly, which has been its own long, difficult conversation between him and her that I've mostly stayed out of on purpose since I don't think that's a fight I get to referee for either one of them. Here's where I actually am with all of this now. Corbin and I are still married, still working through the strange, specific damage of learning that years of your own reactions were quietly edited down by someone else's fabricated narrative. Some days that feels genuinely repairable. Other days it feels like I'm still catching up to how much I let myself be shrunk without ever fully noticing it happening. We started seeing a new therapist together a few months ago, someone entirely outside Anya's old network, someone Harriet has never met and never will. The first session, the new therapist asked Corbin plainly why he'd never once asked me directly about the things his mother reported. He didn't have a clean answer. He said after a long pause, "I think it was easier to believe there was a name for what was happening than to sit in the discomfort of a normal disagreement." I understood that answer more than I wanted to. It's easier sometimes to trust a story that sounds official than to trust the person standing right in front of you. I catch myself still even now doing the thing, pausing before I show any real reaction to something, running a quick automatic check on whether what I'm feeling is going to sound reasonable out loud before I let anyone see it. A friend pointed it out to me recently gently at dinner after I visibly stopped myself mid-sentence over something completely ordinary. I hadn't even noticed I was doing it until she named it. "You just did the thing," she said, not unkindly. The little pause before you let yourself be annoyed. I laughed a little embarrassed and then went quiet because she was right, and because 6 years of that particular habit doesn't just switch off the moment you find out why it started. Corbin's noticed it too in his own way. He started asking me directly and plainly what I actually think about something, instead of gently steering the conversation the way he used to. It's a small shift. It matters more than it probably should, given how long the opposite version ran unchallenged. I'm working on unlearning that particular habit, one ordinary reaction at a time, letting myself be annoyed or tired or upset about something small without pre-editing it first, for an audience that spent 6 years deciding quietly and without my knowledge exactly how much of me was allowed to be real.